we'll continue with a look at joints. Now, joints is anywhere where two bones meet, where two bones come together. They're not necessarily movable. Like the joints in the skull are sutures, and they have virtually no movement. So there's two ways to classify joints. One way is functionally, by what they allow to happen, and the other way is structurally, by how the joint is put together. So functionally, there's three types of joints. There are the completely immovable joints, which are called synarthrosis. So there's synarthrotic joints. There's the freely movable ones called diarthrotic. And then there's the ones in the middle that have some movement but not a lot. And those are amphiarthritic. Amphi means a little of this and a little of that. So ambidextrous, both hands can act as the dominant hand. Amphibians live part of their life cycle as a fish and part as a air-breathing animal. So syn means to come together. So as in synonym or symbiosis or synthesis. Synarthrotic, immovable. Amphiarthrotic, slightly movable. Dia means through, so diarthrotic means that it moves through. Arthra means joint. We won't see this as often as we see the structural categories. Now there's three structural categories with some subcategories under them. It can either come together with fibers, with cartilage, or with a space filled with a fluid that looks like egg white. So the fibrous joints really have collagen fibers holding them together. These joints are especially good under tension. They will resist being pulled apart, the two bones being pulled apart. They're not necessarily very good under compression, being pushed together. So these are the fibrous joints. The cartilaginous joints, in between the two bones, there's a layer of cartilage. It might be hyaline cartilage, it might be fibrocartilage. There are still some collagen fibers that bridge the joint, that hold it together under tension, but not very much. It's primarily joints that are resisting compression, being pushed together. So the cartilaginous joints act more like a cushion. Now, the fibrous joints and the cartilaginous joints tend to be either synarthrotic or amphiarthrotic. To be full diarthrotic, you really need a joint space. And that joint space needs a lubricating liquid in it. And the liquid is about the consistency of egg white. It's very similar to egg white, actually. And that's called synovial joints. Synovial, coming together with eggs. And they're the diarthrotic joints. They're the joints you think of when you think of the joints. So when your wrist or your elbow or your knees are diarthrotic joints. Okay, the fibrous joints, the bones are in close contact. They're held together by dense connective tissue. Most of them are synarthrotic. They're immovable, the sutures of the skull. Some of them are amphiarthrotic, like the distal tib fib joint. But the distal tib fib joint is really holding those two bones together under tension. So the suture of a skull is the type of fibrous joint. Right? Well, the fibrous joints that are held together with more ligamentous sort of things are called syndesmosis. 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 Under the cartilaginous joints, it's either hyaline cartilage or fibrocartilage. Any place where there's going to be shock, where there's going to be hard, like the pubic symphysis or the discs of the spine, there's fibrocartilage because it's tougher than hyaline cartilage. So we call that a symphysis. It goes bone, fibrocartilage, bone. If it goes bone, hyaline cartilage, bone, we call that synchondrosis. Synchondro means cartilage, osis, the condition of coming together with cartilage. So we see a synchondrosis. A typical one is the first rib and sternum type joint. Really, all of the epiphyseal plates would be considered, the growth plates would be considered a synchondrosis cartilaginous joint. Sometimes you'll be referred to as primary and secondary cartilaginous joints, with the synchondrosis being primary, the symphysis being secondary. The vast majority of joints are actually synovial. They allow free movement. They have complex structures. They have an articular cartilage made out of hyaline, but there's a space. And that space is filled with synovial fluid, and that fluid is made by a synovial membrane, kind of a tube that covers the joint itself. There's a joint capsule, which is made of dense connective tissue, and then the synovial membrane that secretes the fluid. Very highly vascular, the synovial membranes. So the typical structure of this is bone, hyaline cartilage, space, hyaline cartilage, bone. On the outside, there's a fibrous capsule. Lining the fibrous capsule, in fact, lining everything that's not covered in cartilage, is synovial membrane. The articular cartilage is hyaline cartilage. The joint cavity is filled with secretions of the synovial membrane. Now, the synovial fluid not only lubricates, but it nourishes that articular cartilage. So it has to be nutrient-rich and oxygen-rich. And it absorbs the carbon dioxide and metabolic waste of the chondrocytes in the cartilage. So it's constantly being made at the synovial membrane, and it's constantly being reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. So there's a big changeover of this stuff all the time. Now, some of the synovial joints have got a further refinement to absorb shock. It's a little pad of fibrocartilage, and it's called a meniscus. Multiple is menisci. We have medial and lateral menisci in each of our knees. We have a meniscus in the radiocarpal joint at your wrist. We have another one in the TMJ in your jaw. Places that are maybe susceptible to some sort of impact. There's another thing that happens to reduce friction. There are these fluid-filled sacs called bursae. And we have them wherever tendons and ligaments cross at sharp angles so that there's no rubbing. They are like what a toy that you used to be able to buy at the dollar store called silly snakes. Remember, they were kind of a rubbery, fluid-filled tube that was kind of hard to hold on to. That's what a bursa is like. And they're there to reduce friction of those tendons and ligaments rubbing over bone. When they get inflamed, you end up with bursitis. There's lots of bursa in the knee and in the shoulder, and a few in the hip. Those are the ones that are clinically the most relevant. So this is looking at the knee. If we look, this is the capsule. This is the synovial membrane running here to the patella. More synovial membrane. This is the articular cartilage, and this is the meniscus here and here. This is fibrocartilage. This is bone. This is joint capsule back here. This is all, this light blue is filled with synovial fluid. There's a bursae here, so that when you flex your knee, the infrapatellar bursa cushions this tendon, which is it's the patellar ligament, but it's a continuation of the quadriceps tendon. It cushions that from rubbing here against the bone. The prepatellar bursa is there to protect the kneecap when you're kneeling. The suprapatellar bursa is a continuation of the synovial space. All of these things are for cushioning. Now, the bursa is, you can see, is synovial membrane bag filled with synovial fluid. It's really no different than this synovial membrane that's in the joint. Okay, there's a number of different types of synovial joints because the different shapes allow for different movements. Excuse me. The most common, or the easiest to understand, it's not common, we only have it in a few places in the body, is the ball and socket joint. And literally, it is a head on the bone that is spherical, globe-shaped, and it articulates into a cup of another bone. Now, this allows movement in a lot of different planes. You can flex, you can extend, you can ab and adduct, and you can rotate. The ball can turn. So, and you can do something called circumduct, which is flexion, extension, ab, and adduction, all done more or less simultaneously. It's the widest amount of motion. The only motion that the ball and socket joint can't do is glide, which means to slip sideways. Now, a similar joint to the ball and socket is something called a condylar joint. And what it is very much like a ball and socket, except that the ball is oval. It's more like an egg shape. And the cavity, the socket that it fits into, is the same shape, oval. So this still allows flexion, extension, ab and adduction, and circumduction. What it doesn't allow is rotation or gliding. So we get this, the very typical one that you can look at is the metacarpal phalangeal joints, the MCP joints in your finger. If you take your index finger, you can flex it, extend it, move it side to side, abduct it, but you can't rotate it like you can your shoulder. You can circumduct, which is twirling your finger, but that's not rotating it. It's just going through a series of add and abductions, flexions, and extensions. When we have our WebEx meeting, I can demonstrate that movement. Now, neither of those joints allow any gliding movement. What allows that is a plane joint. And plane joints have really, for all intents and purposes, flat surfaces. And it allows a sliding, maybe somewhat of a twisting motion to happen. It's like sliding a glass along a bar. The glass doesn't tip. It doesn't change angles to the bar at all. It just translates. It just glides along. Hinge joints are joints that have a convex surface in one bone into a concave surface of another, and it moves like a hinge. It only allows flexion and extension. So the interphalangeal joints of your fingers are examples of that. You can't ab or adduct, you can't circumduct them, you can't rotate it, you can't glide, you can only flex and extend. So these are called uniaxial joints. Some joints allow rotation only, but no change of angle. So that would be like between the axis and atlas of the skull. It's a pivot joint. Another one is between the radius and the ulna in the forearm. There's a proximal radioulnar joint and there's a distal radioulnar joint, and both of them are pivot joints. You can't change the angle between the radius and the ulna, but you can rotate them around one another. The joint that's a little bit harder to understand is something called the saddle joint. Now, the saddle joint is a more stable version of the condyloid joint. You can flex and extend, you can ab and adduct, and you can circumduct, but you can't. It resists gliding more. It's much harder to dislocate it. And the way that it works is the one bone has a convex surface that fits into the concave surface of the other bone, and that same bone has a concave surface that fits into the convex surface of the other bone. Much the same way as a saddle and a rider are. A saddle is concave from the pommel to the back of the saddle, and it's convex from stirrup to stirrup. A person is concave from knee up through the crotch to the other knee, and is convex from the belly button to the bum. So the convexity of the sagittal plane, front to back, meets the concavity of the saddle, pommel to the back of the saddle. On the frontal plane, the saddle has a convexity from stirrup over the top of the saddle to the other stirrup, and the person has a concavity from their knee up through their crotch to their knee on that same frontal plane. And the two then marry together, and it allows you to lean forward, lean back, tilt to one side, tilt to the other. But it doesn't allow rotation or gliding. You stay put on the saddle. And the deeper those concavities, the more stable it is. But it allows quite a range of motion. So we see this in places that are maybe going to be subject to a lot of danger of dislocating through gliding. So places like where your thumb meets the trapezium, the metacarpal of your thumb and the trapezium, when you catch a ball, could dislocate. By having the saddle joint, it is stable. But if you look at your thumb, you can rotate, or you can't rotate it, you can circumduct it, you can flex, extend, ab, and adduct. When you're hitchhiking, you're abducting. When you're touching your little finger, you're adducting. When you got all of those movements. So we'll go through it. So when we look at it, ball and socket is this one. That's literally a ball going into a socket. Condylar joint is an oval going into an oval socket. Plane joint is two flat surfaces. Hinge joint, only flex and extend. A pivot joint rotates around a central axis, and a saddle joint is convex and concave in two directions. So the summary: fibrous joints, you don't get very much movement. Suture joint is a suture or a synostosis, coming together of bone. The joint between the distal end of the tibia and fibula is a syndesmosis. The fibers are a little bit longer. The longer the fibers, the more movement that is allowed. The cartilaginous joints are either hyaline or fibrocartilage. The movement is limited. Fibrocartilage, where there's more shock, like the intervertebral discs, the pubic symphysis, those are symphysis. Both of those are considered a symphysis, which means it's fibrocartilage. The first rib and sternal joint is all hyaline cartilage, but there is no gap, there's no movement. So that is a primary cartilaginous joint, or a synchondrosis. Then the synovial, freely moving with a ball and socket, condylar, plane, hinge, pivot, and saddle versions of it. So obviously in the synovial joints, there's going to be a lot of different types of motions, and we name all of these motions. And we have to be able to describe them. So flexion is whenever the two bones, the angle between the two bones decreases. So bending your elbow, taking a drink, is flexing the elbow. Bending your knees, flexion of the knees. The angle is decreasing. Extension is the opposite. Extension is straightening, the angle increases. Now in the axial skeleton, because it's on the center line, bending your body forward is flexing, leaning backwards is extending, but leaning sideways is called lateral flexion. Now, I won't get into hyperextension, but that's going beyond the normal anatomical position. That's stressing the joint. So ab and adduction is moving away from the midline or towards the midline. Abduct, to take away, to carry away, is moving away from the midline. So when your arms are in anatomical position and you raise your arm to shoulder level, that's abducting the arm. You're moving away from the body's midline. When you take your index finger and move it towards your thumb, that's abducting your index finger. Moving the index finger towards the middle finger is adducting. You're moving towards the center line of the hand. Moving your arm from out at the side towards your hip, towards the side, is adducting. Pushing your knees together, adduction of the legs, of the thighs. Your knees apart, abducting. So, flexion, extension, ab and adduction, lateral flexion. Now there's some special movements. In the foot, really, because your tibia and fibula meet almost halfway in the back part of your foot, halfway on the calcaneus, not with your toes, the angle between the two bones is decreasing on one side and increasing on the other, no matter which way you move your foot. So we call moving your toes towards the shins dorsiflexion, because you're moving the foot dorsally. And we call standing on your tiptoes plantar flexion, moving your toes away from the shins, pointing your toes. So ballet dancers, plantar flex. Rotation is any movement around an axis with no change in angle. Circumduction is the angle is constantly changing. So if we start with the shoulder and you abduct the shoulder and then bring the shoulder forward, which is flexion, so you're abducting and flexion at the same time, and then you adduct while you're still flexing, so you're moving it down, and then you extend and adduct, and then you completely extend, and then you extend and abduct, and you make that kind of circular motion. That's called circumduction. Now, in the forearm, pronation is the palm facing down, and supination is the palm facing up. Supine is on the spine. When you lay on your back, you're supine. When you lay on your stomach, you're prone. I've heard students use, you put your hand in supination to carry a cup of soup. So dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, circumduction. Now rotation happens here. Medial rotation is moving towards the midline. Lateral rotation is moving away from the midline. Supination and pronation, turning the forearm over. In the foot, you can, if you turn the soles, the plantar surface of the foot medially, so that you can press the bottoms of your feet together, that's called inversion. If you are moving it laterally, so that your big toe is down, that's eversion. If you jut your jaw forward, that's protract. If you bring your jaw back so that you have an overbite, that's retract. Elevation is raising the body part, so if you shrug your shoulders, you're elevating your scapula. Depressing is lowering. That's the opposite of elevating. So in an eversion, protract, retract, elevation, depression. And that's all we're going to cover with joints. We will continue next set of videos on the muscular system.